In last week's reading from John, we heard Jesus saying that now is the time. Jesus was a man with a plan. And you'll remember what he said about seeds, that until a seed falls to the ground and dies, it can't do anything. It remains only a seed. But when it falls and dies, when it breaks down and casts off its crispy outer coating, it's able to transform, to shoot out and grow, and to become fruitful itself. So in that passage last week, Jesus was both foreshadowing his own death and how the seed that he was about to transform the world. And he was also reminding us that we too must cast off our earthly preoccupations, our crispy outer shells, all those things that prevent us from being and showing the love that God calls on us to be and to show. We must cast off that shell in order that the seed in us can also transform into a fruitful plant. So last week, we had a passage that, although foreshadowing Jesus' death, was a hugely hopeful, joyful passage of promise and possibility. Jesus, a man with a plan, willingly going headfirst into the ultimate sacrifice, so that from his one seed, he could make seeds of all of us. And this week, we see that plan being implemented. This week, we see Jesus leading the way into Jerusalem, where he went first to the temple and threw out the people who were misusing it, leading the way to the Passover festivities. It's Jesus who arranged the room where they have the Last Supper, leading the way to the Mount of Olives, despite knowing that Jesus will betray him, despite knowing that Peter will disown him. Jesus knows exactly what's going to happen to him, yet, not my will, but yours be done, he says. So, what are we to make of it all? When we celebrate Palm Sunday, are we just mimicking the crowds who cheered Jesus on his way into Jerusalem? It feels a little odd, doesn't it? Bearing in mind that we know exactly what happened next, when we know that this was the first step towards Jesus' crucifixion. Or does it feel odd? Maybe what we're really celebrating today isn't any one event. Maybe we are celebrating the resolute determination of Jesus to be that seed that he told us about in our reading last week. That seed that falls to the ground in order to bring about a wider transformation, in order to spread God's love across the world, in order to become the mighty tree that makes seeds of the rest of us. Because look, here we are, seeds, still sitting here in a church in East London, in England, 2,000 years later. Jesus' entry into Jerusalem marks the first main step in the implementation of his plan. The locals at the time had no idea. They thought their Messiah was coming to liberate them from foreign rule. And yet, here was a man on a donkey who had his sights set on something far more important, far more momentous, far more transformational. Jesus was about to show them the logical destination, the culmination, the endpoint of his message. Where Jesus' followers are told to subordinate themselves to serve others, to love their neighbour, he was about to show them what that meant to the extreme. Greater love hath no man than to lay down his life for his friends. Jesus' whole ministry was about living what he preached. He had no riches, no ties, no priorities, other than living out his message of love and bringing as many people as he possibly could closer into a relationship with God. And so here we have Jesus staring death in the face and still actively, knowingly walking straight forwards towards it. Here we have Jesus living his message and showing ultimate love. The narrative that we have in Mark's Gospel, covering the period in the lead up to the crucifixion, is a text full of urgency and chaos. Mark walks us through from one place to the next in Jerusalem, giving us a detailed account of each interaction, one after the other, each becoming more and more chaotic and more absurd. We're taken from the Last Supper, where Jesus announces that one of the 12 will betray him, to the Mount of Olives, where he asks his followers to remain awake while he goes off to pray. And of course, they can't even do that. To Judas betraying him with a kiss, and someone else cutting off the ear of the high priest's servant. To a hearing in front of the chief priests, full of false testimonies, where he's eventually accused of blasphemy. To Peter thrice disowning him. Next, to a hearing before Pilate, who didn't really know what to do with him, but eventually bowed to the pressure of the crowds and handed him over for flogging and crucifixion. To the soldiers who mocked and beat him up. To the crucifixion itself, where he continued to be mocked and shouted at. Darkness then fills the land, and Jesus calls to God, "Why have you forsaken me?" And all this chaos and horror then finally comes to an end when we're told that with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. So Mark shows us through all of this narrative how this chaotic series of events was packed with the worst side of human nature: lies, hatred, violence, scorn. There's no fairness or justice here. In his book, Christ on Trial, Rowan Williams rightly compares it to the passage in C.S. Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. You might know the passage. "Let the jury consider their verdict," the king said for about the 20th time that day. "No, no," said the queen. "Sentence first, verdict afterwards." And in the same way, we're told right at the beginning of chapter 14 in Mark's Gospel that the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for some sly way to arrest Jesus and kill him. Justice was never their plan. They had decided his sentence already, and the verdict must get in line. Sentence first, verdict afterwards. And so we face in these passages a stark contrast, total opposites. A Jesus who is all love, all peace, all humility, contrasted with those who want to bring him down, liars, full of hatred, inflicting violence and plotting his murder. And in the face of it all, Jesus doesn't argue or fight. In the face of all the lies told against him, he remains silent. There's a passage in chapter 6 of Luke's Gospel where Jesus says, "I tell you who hear me, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you. Pray for those who ill-treat you. If someone strikes you on one cheek, turn to him the other also. If someone takes your cloak, do not stop him from taking your tunic." And Jesus concludes, "Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful." I often preach things in the pulpit, and then I go home and find that I'm not practicing what I preach. I do it all the time. We all know what we should be doing, but we struggle and fail to do it. Yet here's Jesus, going through just about the worst thing that you can imagine, the worst thing that another human can throw at you, and still living, still embodying his message of love, mercy, and forgiveness. What an incredible example to set. And yet when we fail, we know we're not alone. We see in Jesus' followers all the same failings that we exhibit. From the huge crowds chorusing, "Hosanna!" when he first entered, only a small number followed him. And that number had reduced even further by the time we reached the Mount of Olives. Even those few followers who were still with him on the Mount of Olives, even they can't do the simple task that he asked of them: stay awake. And Peter, one of the closest disciples, disowns Jesus 3 times, despite having promised that he would never disown him. "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you," Peter said. Yet mere hours later, he tells those around, "I don't know this man you're talking about." All these people who knew Jesus physically, personally, walked with him, talked with him, even they fell short. Even they stumbled at the first hurdle. So we're not alone. But as always, Jesus shows us what's possible. In our world of selfishness, when there's so much emphasis on our feelings and what we're getting out of something. What am I getting out of this act of worship? Is this Sunday service working for me? Do we too often make things about us? Jesus shows us that in the very worst conditions, we can and should be seeking to be selfless. And in a world where we want to control everything, Jesus shows us how to surrender our will to God. And so, while the temptation might be to view the run-up to Easter through a negative, sad, mournful lens because of the events that took place, it is actually a period of great hope. A period that can inspire us to be that seed, to cast off our crispy outer coating of whatever it is that's distancing each one of us from God and from our neighbour, knowing that Jesus himself went through the very worst that life could throw at him, and yet held firm to God's message of love and service. May we also hold firm to that message, and may we work harder and harder every day to grow into a fruitful tree that in turn produces more seed. Amen.